you're ready to go, I will ask you, um, who would you say has had the greatest influence on you as a professional?
Hmm. I think my first boss,
Hmm.
and that would be the chief of staff for the Israeli ambassador to the United States back
Ah.
in 2000. So I had interned some professionally or when I was in college, and it wasn't necessarily new to the work environment, but your first full-time job is incredibly formative. You learn a great deal directly and indirectly. You
Right.
skin your knee a lot. And I would say my first boss was he demanded a certain level of work that I really admired and unfortunately didn't meet a lot of the time because I didn't know
Oh
intelligence.
no.
No, I was, I was hired as a speechwriter. Learned very quickly that I do not do that. I just I was the world's worst speechwriter,
Oh
and
dear.
but I learned a great deal about trying to strengthen certain muscles that uh, need to be trained at one point or another, whether it's just writing and communications or understanding political context or what have you. But I think my first boss was really, I admired his work ethic. I really admired his standard of excellence. I admired his smarts. He was just totally brilliant and could think on, it felt like 50 different levels all at once, and could see ahead in ways that were like, how did you know that was going to happen? Like, what? And there's a certain art to persuasion that I think that was the biggest takeaway from this first position was rather than just communication arts and all of that, speech writing is really about persuasion and telling a story. And that I definitely learned. I still very much a work in progress. But yeah, in terms of, I count those first 2 years, and they were wacky ones for the world, not just,
Yeah, no kidding.
right. So it was, I think, a multi-sensory experience, truly. And,
Got it.
yeah, and there was also this element of like, he really, really appreciated the micro and the macro. I think there was not a detail that didn't leave him, but he wasn't a micromanager. And yet you knew that you needed to have put a comma at the end of that sentence or at that fragment because he would catch it. He just would.
Mm-hmm.
And while also talking about how a certain policy talking point was rooted in context that led back to Ottoman times, so there was,
right.
yeah, there was a lot of, and honestly, I learned so much that school just does not prepare you for the world of work. It just doesn't, unless you're learning like how to be a lab technician, I guess, or like more of like the sciences or something like that. Yeah, I think that. So I'm not sure I would call him a role model. It was definitely a formative person in the work environment that
not
shaped
necessarily a role model. Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. Excellent. And now you're relatively young, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. What are the worst and best things that have ever happened to you in your life, and what did you learn from them?
Like personally, professionally?
Either or both.
All right, so we'll get a little heavy. The worst thing that's ever happened to me is that my father, 4.5 years ago, was killed in a workplace shooting.
Oh, my goodness.
So that was, yes. And that was a complete, I'm literally at a loss of words. It was incredibly violent, incredibly unexpected, puts everything in perspective and nothing in perspective. Yeah, and that honestly, that's why I'm in this position as a result and have had a really weird 4-year trajectory. But that is by far the worst experience I've ever encountered. There have been others that have been pretty bad, but I'd say that's the worst.
What
I've learned
from it?
I would say a couple things. One is that you can't control anything. I mean, we can delude ourselves into thinking that like we can control things and like be very organized, and I pride myself on like being very scheduled and whatever, but like we can't control anything. Like really, you make a plan and God laughs, or whatever that saying is. So there is a certain element of let go that I've tried to have. Honestly, it's personified in different ways. I still, it's not like I'm like, well, the money will just happen, for raising money for an organization. It's not like having faith in that way. It's understanding that you take actions and like 80% of it is up to you. 20% can totally like blow up in your face. So there's a certain element of control and uncertainty that I think I've recognized and am digesting. It's still very much a work in progress.
Sure.
I think there's also something having to do with patience. I just don't have patience for things that don't matter. And I think that's if more of us operated with that kind of guiding assumption, I think the world would be much more beautiful and matter more and just more real. And the third is, I think what it's taught me is to really empathize with people who have suffered. There's a whole other level of whether it's grief or disease or all of the curveballs that life throws you that again you can't control. It's definitely made me more able to empathize with and be compassionate and be really truly present with people, and that's professionally and personally. I mean, whether it's friends or professional people who I just know are struggling or suffering in some way, and we all kind of suffer to our own degree. There are things that get into like psychoanalysis that I've learned, but we won't go there for this particular purpose.
And what about the best thing?
The best thing. That's a fun question. I would say getting this job, honestly, like working at this organization that is trying to tackle a pretty big problem that could be a model for tackling other problems. And, you asked about my role model. I have 18 board members, and I would say a healthy majority of those are my role models. Like, they are stellar professionals, all different styles, but they're effective. They act with integrity. They move things forward, even though there are politics along the way. I really feel like there's I'm kind of at the feet of giants, like learning at the feet of giants type of role. Because if you look at my board, these are people who are heading huge foundations, working on some of the most difficult, really wicked problems. Like ours, I don't think is a wicked problem. I think it's a structural problem. It's adaptive, sure, but it's not like Middle East peace or poverty. It's like, okay, organizations have to change. Let's call Vivien. Like that's there could be those types of solutions.
Right.
Yeah, I think getting this job, because there's an added level of meaning to this work for me, and I really like these people are incredible. They're incredible, and they're real professionals on like an expert level. Not just people who are kind of winging it. And that's been it. Look, it's been intense as well. Like we have a very, very bold, big problem to work on. But from a meaning perspective, from a mission alignment perspective, from an ability to really build something that I believe matters. On macro, there have been. This would be a real highlight.
Great, fantastic. Thank you. And what, if anything, at the moment is keeping you up at night?
I'm sorry. Say again. You cut out a little bit.
What at the moment, if anything, is keeping you up at night?
Oh God. What is keeping me up at night? I would say our strategy, making sure that we're really working on the things that matter, the levers that are the most important that can be a force multiplier. Understanding that there are tectonic shifts all the time, and that's something that it requires us to be nimble in a way that is constantly making my mind run. I would say that. Resources, Even though I've got 18 board members, they all bring with them the capacity to give a tremendous amount. We still have to demonstrate value, not to mention demand for our different products, if you will. Right. And that takes time. Right. And the pace of philanthropy, as we know, isn't necessarily in sync with the pace of getting stuff done. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a big one that is really literally keeping me up at night. Mm-hmm. I think the third is there is a lot of pressure in this role to really embody the type of values and best practices that we are preaching. So to make sure we're not hypocritical, and Vivien, we're totally hypocritical.
Make sure you're not what? Sorry?
Hypocritical.
Oh, hypocritical.
Like we're saying every Jewish organization has to be a great place to work, which means that Leading Edge has to be a great place to work. Which means we're working on boards and making sure that boards espouse best practices. Well, our board in many ways is amazing, and in many ways is shifting because we were a founding board. Like there are things that we, certain infrastructure and certain best practice foundational things that we need to do. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that that we need to be aligned with what we're selling. And the reality is that we are a startup, so there's no real work-life balance when you're in year like 0 to 2. There's just not, right. Unless you're really flush with cash. But there too, again, like resources, you gotta prove that you can actually do something well with them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'd say those are the three.
How old is Leading Edge?
We are 2.5 years old. Like this was started. There was initially a report done by Bridgespan, in fact, really bringing to light some of the elements of this problem. Like we really have a leadership pipeline problem in the Jewish community. Yep. And it was these founders who said, all right, well, let's pull some funds. Let's work together. Let's turn around our sector. Let's build a leadership pipeline here because all of our investments are exposed, essentially. Now, if you don't have good leaders at the helm, your investment and your grant in an organization is probably not going to be maximized. So this is important. Yeah, and then I was hired in late 2014. So it's been, it's like 2.5 years.
Got it. And so this next one, you sort of have a choice, right? In other words, you can answer the question, what is your definition of happiness? Or what is your philosophy of life?
Wow. These are real softballs, Vivien. I don't know. Okay. All right. I would say let me go with the definition of happiness because I've got two that are kind of working. One that's literally staring me at the wall right now because I need to be grounded in it. And one that I heard recently of a recent book that came out that I also really liked. So the first one is from Maya Angelou. And it basically said,
which one?
Maya Angelou.
No, I know, but which one of her quotes?
So this is it. It's success is liking yourself, liking what you do, liking how you do it. I think we can substitute success with happiness. I think that's it. I think you are happy if you like yourself, if you like what you do, and if you like how you do it. That's the first. The second is I think that there's some like Google engineer or something who just came out with, I think it's called like the happiness quotient or something like that. And a lot of these books I kind of like look at and I'm like, look, I appreciate positive psychology and all this kind of stuff. But he had a very, very, he had the definition of happiness that really resonated with me. And it was something to the effect of you are happy when your expectations align with reality. Period. That really resonates for me.
Yeah, no kidding. I love that.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. He's really, he also like, he came to like this whole thing. His story is also like his son died suddenly and he was like, kind of reeling and it felt like a very honest journey to find this. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to remember that one. And what would you say is the greatest misconception about you?
Honestly, that I know what I'm doing. Major imposter syndrome. Really. Like major. Like we are having to create a lot of things as we ship them, and that, I think that there is this perception, and I'm talking professionally now, that we have a plan, we know what we're doing, everything is set, and that's not true. Nothing is set in stone ever. It shouldn't be when you're dealing with organizations that have to bob and weave through traffic. I think there is a sense of confidence that has I'm very grateful for it, but there's a lot of pressure with that. And the fact is that this is a communal undertaking. This isn't like, okay, Gali will solve the problem. It's like, no, we have to solve the problem together. I think that, I'm not sure if it's a misconception. I just feel like the insides don't necessarily match the outsides.
Understood. I can relate to that, actually. And so this one, you must live this one. So what's the most important thing you tell young people who are thinking about making careers in the social sector?
You have to be ambitious. Do not expect things to fall in your lap. I think that's the biggest thing, especially for millennials. And there are different types of millennials. There are the younger millennials and then there are the older millennials. There's really a difference between those 12 years or so. There are definitely those professionals who feel like they don't have to earn anything. And that is a prescription for being incredibly unhappy and disappointed, apropos your expectations are never going to meet the reality in that regard. And don't expect that everything is going to be handed to you on a silver platter. Make sure that there is sort of an anticipation of the next step and an ambition to learn additional skills and have those coffees with people to increase your network, even though you're not actively looking for anything, because our world is one where people stay in a role about 3 years. And that it used to be 30. So things have changed greatly.
Right.
Yeah, it's very much this is a do-it-yourself career time. You're not on some sort of conveyor belt that's okay, it's plug and play. Look, there are some corporations that certainly make it a lot easier, but there too, you've got to manage certain internal politics, and there's shifting big departments and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot more movement than there was ever before, and a lot more movement than school trains you to deal with. That's my biggest one. It's really depending on who I'm talking to, it's usually lose the entitled attitude, because it's just not gonna serve you well in any way, shape, or form. I don't care how smart you are.
Right. And I'm curious about the difference between the older and the younger millennials, and what and which camp the ambition thing is particularly relevant for, or
I think the younger ones. The older ones understand, and these are people who are 30 now, right? There's 30 to 35,
right,
or 28 to 35 right now. That's kind of the segment. The younger ones, I think, have let's think about what they've consumed that mass media has shown them. They've shown them that you can start in a garage and build a billion-dollar company that is going to be acquired by Facebook or Google or Apple. That is another type. These are different companies that were starting in a garage. So there is that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, which is fantastic. But there's a difference why MySpace died and Facebook didn't. It really is all about the leadership. MySpace really messed up. This should have absolutely been Facebook. So there's that. But no, I mean, I think it's the younger ones who, I see a very pronounced difference in their expectations of what the world owes them, and an understanding of what they need to chase.
Got it. And what new opportunities now you're a new organization, so
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine everything it seems new, but what new opportunities do you see for Leading Edge in the next 5 years?
So I see two. One has to do with coordination. So I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of organizations like Single Stop. Do you know Single Stop?
Yeah, I do
Here
indeed.
in New York. Right. So a perfect example of an organization that said, all right, listen, I can't change lumbering, bureaucratic, gnarly departments within city government. You know, you've got the political, private, and nonprofit all enmeshed into this ball. But what I can do is I can cut through the friction. Let me be the WD-40, the one place where you come to understand all that. I think we have an opportunity to think in that way. I don't know how it's going to be personified because we have a massive coordination problem when it comes to the 9,500 organizations that are in our catchment area in the United States, all of the different micro communities they're in. So the 9,500 Jewish organizations embody all of the Jewish infrastructure within the United States. So we really are a microcosm of all of society because we have social service agencies and community centers and religious and et cetera. And there's a siloization there that makes it very difficult to connect among different types of players, and we just don't have that infrastructure or those habits in place. Mm-hmm. We are really thinking about how can we rewire some of those habits, or how can we at least create the ability to shuttle between these different players so that when we do have high potential individuals who want to make a difference in the world and work in the Jewish community, that they're not just stuck in one organization without having the peripheral vision of all the others and the other opportunities outside of the Jewish community, frankly, but that we're able to show them that in a, kind of IMAX kind of way. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing I would say, coordination. The second is there's a certain repurposing that we've been thinking about and really drawing inspiration from a lot of like New York parks and specifically the High Line. So if you think about all the infrastructure that is within our organizations and all the tracks, if you will, it's unbelievable. We've got synagogues. There are about 3,000 synagogues within the United States. The vast majority of them have some sort of building.
Yep.
Not to mention the Jewish community centers and like all these things. And these buildings were once amazing. They were like palaces of connection and renewal and worship and what have you. Now, the vast majority of them are sarcophaguses or sarcophagi.
No kidding. So
how can we find a way to breathe new life really creatively? How can we repurpose these spaces? And I'm not just talking about the physical. I'm talking really about like organizational. So how can we think about them in different ways and really add beauty to this world and meaning and a certain purpose? I think those two things. The third has to do more with just points of intervention that we think are in the next 5 years we are going to press a lot more deeply. So, and that the two places having to do there is culture. Like, can we make every Jewish organization a great place to work? How do we do that? And the second is volunteer leadership. How can we make sure that every funder, every board member, every volunteer leader in whatever capacity understands that the value of their organization is only as good as its people, and that they need some training as well or support.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent. Those are certainly wonderful and ambitious goals. I'm not laughing. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you, right? I mean, I happen to have in my consulting practice, I've worked with a number of Jewish organizations, and particularly in strategic planning. So I get it. So let's see. So this may or may not resonate with you, but I'll ask it anyway because it's an interesting question. We're in the midst of a national conversation about race and racial equity. What is your organization doing both internally and externally to address racial inequity? Now, it may be that you're not in the Jewish world, right? I mean, certainly the organizations that you represent, many of them are working on this issue in different ways.
Yeah.
So it may not. Why don't we move on, if that's okay?
Well, I will say this. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, the biggest point, it's not about race, it's about gender. That's our biggest point of work, I would say. We see our work as based on 3 Gs, if you will: gender, generation, geography. Those are the 3 dimensions that make this a complicated tapestry and puzzle. The gender piece is very, very much akin to some of the racial inequity problems that are happening in a lot of society. And so we've been working on that in direct and indirect ways. But look, there is a Jews of color. There is a, unfortunately, marginalized community of Jews of color who are oftentimes forgotten, and we want to bring into the conversation in much more robust ways. But as it relates to this, our biggest work, it has to do with gender, since we've got...
So as in more women in leadership roles?
Different. So what we have is we've got 70% of CEOs are men, 30% are women, whereas the rest of the pipeline, if you will, the people who are not CEOs, 70% are women, 30% are men.
Yeah.
So it's very akin to, the 70% of CEOs in the general community, I'm not sure if that's the right division, let's call it that, are Caucasian, not people of color, and then 30% are, and yet overwhelmingly the people maybe in the pipeline and certainly the end users are people of color.
Right.
So for us, it's more, what is it about the C-suite in our Jewish community that isn't inviting, that isn't able to attract, that isn't looking for women?
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because I happen to have gone to Wharton to get my MBA, and when I went to Wharton, it was a long time ago, but my Wharton class was about 30% women, and guess what? Today's graduating Wharton class, about 30% women. So it starts early.
Yeah.
It starts early. And this is by contrast with law school and medical school, interestingly, where at this point, I think both medical school and law school are slightly more than 50% women. And so business school is the only one of the quote-unquote professional schools, right, not the only, but there are other professions, right, but where this is still true. So I throw that out as sort of not that everyone has to have an MBA to run an organization. They don't, in my opinion, but it's just an interesting thing for you guys to think about, right? Is there a way? I don't know if you're thinking about the pipeline of leadership, right? Is there a way to encourage more women to go to business school, for example, or even to go to the Wagner School, right, at NYU, for example? So anyway, I throw that out there. Let's see. So every year or so, U.S. Trust does a study of high net worth individuals. And the 2016 study shows that these individuals have greater confidence in nonprofits and in individuals than they have in the government, the president, or Congress. This is before the election even. So is
this any different than other years? I'm just wondering.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. I don't know, but it's a good question.
Okay.
So, with a new administration in Congress, what role should the independent sector and organizations like Leading Edge play over the next 2 to 4 years, given that at least high net worth individuals have more confidence in us or in you than they do in these other institutions?
it strikes me that as the public sector shrinks, honestly, especially given the new administration and all of the different slashes in budgets and whatnot that are happening, whether it's to HUD or education or all of the different values that many of us hold dear and paramount as opposed to just defense, that who's going to fill these gaps to the best of that they can? It's going to be nonprofits funded by philanthropy, no longer government. Mm-hmm. And I would really love for the independent sector or council on foundations or whoever is working on the intersection of policy meets the nonprofit sector meets philanthropy meets private wealth, frankly, that would be a more direct way of infusing private funding to do public good. I think that there are some controls in there that we need to put in, but I think that that's going to be needed, or else there are going to be a lot of people who are hungry and in need and suffering, frankly, that we're going to have to deal with as a society. So there's a private wealth funneled to public good kind of direct route that I think needs to be clarified and really amplified. And I think that then there's the element of, so let's go to the individuals who hold a tremendous amount of wealth within our society and have maybe made the giving pledge and what have you, and show them that there are certain social problems that are not going to be going away, and that they now are in a unique front-running role that they can decide to play. And an example of, we have within our coalition of this funding collaborative that's dealing with leadership, we have a lot of people who fund different types of things in the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. And there are a lot of questions about the responsibility of philanthropy to fill in a lot of the government funding. And this is also an opportunity to do some, to maybe experiment and do some innovation there, because private funding is not going to be able to fund at the level of public dollars. It's just we don't have access to taxes from millions of people here in New York, let's say, to fund education, the education department that's going to be slashed. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, there's a supply and demand issue here that I think that these individuals or these organizations can play. One is, let's make it easier for private funds to go into nonprofits or efforts that are hoping to solve some of these social problems in easier ways and more direct ways. And the second part of that argument is, let's make sure that these private seeds of wealth, that they have more control than ever now, than maybe ever in history, for that matter, when it comes to doing good and that potential, and making the case for them that there are certain public policy issues that affect all of us, and certainly like their kids and our environment and all of that. And and they shouldn't shy away from it. I mean, if the government is going to stop funding the NEA, okay, private philanthropy, step up, and then hopefully the next administration can undo that. But there are all these different places where there's a trimming of the fat that philanthropy can certainly come and lead by example in ways that are really beautiful. And I think that that's where independent sector, council foundations, any of these kind of advocacy / affinity groups can really play a role in helping to build this movement.
Interesting, because we're members of independent sector, and we just joined last year, and we're actually we just applied to run a workshop at this year's conference, which is in Detroit, actually, in October. And I think IS has new leadership, and I think he's taking the organization in the right direction. I think we have members for a long time, so we can't really tell how different it is. But certainly he's trying new and interesting things. So, for example, he sent several staff members, IS staff members, to Detroit for a month to work with nonprofits in Detroit to really understand the challenges of Detroit because the conference is going to be there. And I thought that was a really interesting move, right? Try to have them be closer to the community because as an association, right, they can be pretty far removed, right, from the challenges.
Completely.
So,
yeah.
So I think it's an interesting. So I'm sort of watching what he does with interest. His name is Dan Cardinale. He was running. What was he running? He was running one of the secondary school organization for a number of years before this. Maybe the name will come to me. Maybe it won't.
Okay.
It probably
yeah.
will.
Well, that sounds like great.
Yeah, kind of an innovation, right? I'm sure they've never done. And by the way, we've met some of the IS board members, and they're an impressive lot. We actually interviewed some of them.
Nice. Well, that's great to hear. It's great to hear.
Yeah. So here's one that I think might be really interesting to you. So in right after the election, the New York Times reported the widening political divergence between cities and small-town America reflects a growing alienation between the two groups and a sense, perhaps accurate, that their fates are not connected. The question is, what role could the independent sector, the social sector, play to help the two groups find greater common ground?
Well, it sounds like in many ways they're starting it. And there I look to the example of what was the Association of Small Foundations, and now it's Exponent Philanthropy. So I used to be on that board, and I have to tell you, it is one of the coolest collection of people, not only the board as a microcosm, but the coolest collection of people who are philanthropists, funders directly, foundation professionals, literally across the country. And you'd meet like the guy who's the biggest funder in Tennessee, in like one of the forgotten districts or whatever, but he's doing incredible work on crop development or something like that. And they would give him a platform to talk about it because like the way that they're doing that kind of small town relational philanthropy matters. It really matters and can be absolutely extrapolated. That the relational nature of our work and in our work specifically, we're a family business. So that's like a whole other layer of different personal, right? But I think that's where, like, look, the geography, that there's a reason why we work on that vector. I think that's a very, very important point, and especially when you see, I don't think it's necessarily just large cities. Like, look, I grew up in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is very different than New York or D.C. where I lived, or Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to school. So you got, the Midwest is sort of like, no, I'm not Chicago, and it's like, all right, well, then we don't matter to the coasts, right? But meanwhile, Minneapolis has like one of the highest rated Fortune 500 companies located in one area and is at the mouth of Mississippi and or the source. So I do think it's true. I think that there is this disconnect, and it's kind of like it's part of like the pendulum swinging the other way. So it used to be that we were far apart because of literally geography. Like it took X amount of hours or days to get from point A to point B on a horse and buggy, and then we cut down that timing a great deal through different technology and transportation innovation, and specifically with technology now, what we're seeing is that people like to be with their own kind. So and that's part of the whole fake news and, blue stream, red stream kind of thing. And like there is a premium. That the whole element of why we're talking about coordination, why we're thinking about connection, is because there has been a dearth of that. The pendulum really has swung, so that I can self-select and I can only sit around the table with Jewish community centers. Well, what if you were to throw a Jewish, startup in there? Oh my God, that would shake up the entire paradigm. Same thing, same principle, very much able to be translated when you're talking about large urban centers, and then you're talking about smaller schools with maybe the kind of infrastructure that isn't as advanced, but there were certain innovations at that point or whatever. I think Detroit is a great example. It used to be so big, and then it shrunk, and there are all these like socioeconomic elements and blighted neighborhoods and all this type of stuff, and there's a lot of innovation as a result. Same thing in New Orleans, especially with Katrina. They've completely remade that city. And so I guess a very long answer to say I totally agree with that. I do think that there are platforms. There are places where people of different types are coming together based on some sort of shared belief or value interest. And those are the places that are most interesting. I mean, it kind of goes back to like the Medici salons. You'd have the poet and the painter and the plumber and the whatever come together and that cross-fertilization is magical. Yeah.
Yes. And that reminded me of an organization that might be of interest. It's new. It's called the Chisel. The Chisel.
The Chisel. Okay.
The Chisel. Yep. And what it is, it's a series of platforms on issues like paid family leave that are created by a combination of scholars on the left and the right.
That's beautiful.
And so everyone has to, before a policy goes, and then they put the policy up on the platform, and they solicit feedback, sometimes from a slightly larger group and sometimes from the public, about the platform, about the sort of the I guess you call it a platform, right, on something like paid family leave, and so there's no way anyone can say that this is a partisan platform, because it's the opposite of partisan.
Beautiful.
And so I think it's called the Chisel. I know the founder. If any of the organizations you work with are looking for really good policy, really good sort of nonpartisan policy planks, or, they would be found on the Chisel.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yep. Okay. How would you say, and I'm getting close to the end here, how are the choices of very wealthy private philanthropists influencing traditional foundation giving, would you say?
Ask the question again?
Wealth. How are the choices of this new group of very wealthy private philanthropists, how are their choices influencing traditional foundation giving, if at all, in your opinion?
I think they're helping bigger foundations, like I think of like the Ford Foundation or something like that, take more risk. So if you look at Mark Zuckerberg, right? Like he has part of the Giving Pledge, what have you, and then they put together that Chan Zuckerberg, I don't know what it's called, but like, basically all of their wealth, right, 99% of their stock or whatever, in this entity that can invest in all different types of organizations that are working on the issues that they want to solve the problem of. I see the Ford Foundation's recent decision to take a slice of their endowment and actually make for-profit investments in the type of social enterprise, an extension of that. Do they really like almost give them cover to be able to say, okay, like, and I do think that there is this link that I never understood why people don't get it, and like maybe they're getting it more now, or maybe I don't get it, but there is something about philanthropy, like we know it's supposed to be the risk capital of society. I do think that given the administration, given the fact that we're going to like tighten our belts in many different ways on public policy that we're not able to do sexy kind of risk. We are going to have to fund some basic foundational type of projects, but foundations should be acting more like venture capitalists. That's really part of the way that we're going to move society forward, as I see it. More than beyond just like them getting the tax break, it's not only funding the museum, but within the museum can actually make us think different, better, what have you. And I think that's what the younger funders or the funders coming out of, I think, a certain discipline or mind frame or worldview are saying. There's a certain level of impatience. There's a certain level of intrepidness that they have that is asking questions and isn't necessarily going to be satisfied with, well, the reason why we do it is because this is how it's always been done. Okay, that's wonderful, but if you think of private, any foundation that has a living donor, and I've worked at two, any foundation that has a living donor, that donor a lot of the time is somebody who's been able to find ways to break the rules or bend the rules in order to make a lot of money, which means that they, by nature, have a certain risk tolerance, or at least an entrepreneurial ability that the rest of the 99% don't have because they figured it out. And that could be timing, and that could be luck, and it's a lot of it together. But it does seem like the institutional funders, like the foundations that are professionalized and are far removed from their original founder, do have a certain level of rigor that I appreciate. And certainly now that I'm a grantee, I'm like, thank you, But there's some sort of happy balance between over-processing and being able to just get some capital to be like, I'm not sure what the theory of change is perfectly, but let's try it. Let's do some R&D.
Right. Got it. So, and that was my last question was, if there were one thing you could say to your colleagues who are leading grant-making foundations, what would it be?
Yeah, free up the money. I mean, seriously. Free up the money. Exactly. Both from a risk and a pacing. That's the biggest thing. Most ideas don't see the light of day. Look, maybe they shouldn't, but especially I'm gonna say in our community, there's an oligopoly when it comes to funding. There are about 80% of donors. They're all around my board, and I would say I'm on the good side on this. But there are 80% of funders who are sitting around a table who can make or break anything they want to, and that can be beautiful in many ways. And thank God they're on the side of good. But what would it look like for the spigot to open a little bit and to not have to be on a pace that is, an annual board meeting or a quarterly board meeting? And there are great examples again around my boardroom that of a certain level of risk taking that's refreshing. I feel like if we were to have more, it would be great. And and that still has process, and controls. I'm not saying just write a book to somebody or write a check to somebody who you sat next to who made you a good pitch. We know that there are a lot of good salespeople who are good salespeople, and maybe their sales pitch is hollow. But there are a lot of people who maybe are not great salespeople, but their ideas are pretty incredible, and they can actually bring them to life. And we just don't have the capability of connecting the people with the capital to the best idea that could potentially meet everyone's needs. And that, I feel like that's up to the funders, and they can change, and that needs to change.
Cool. Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. I honestly, I don't know if I was cogent because we've gone through a lot of different things.
Yeah. No, well, that was the idea. In our experience, that a lot of the people we've talked to actually have appreciated that they could sort of step back and reflect a little bit about these questions because they're meant to be provocative.
Right.
And so I'll tell you what the next step is. So we're actually in the process of writing the book. And if we've got so many wonderful interviews that not all of them will be able to be in this book. We think we may actually have enough for a second book.
Wow.
But we're trying to at least quote everyone that we've interviewed. And so we, and again, I can't say with, and I'm just saying, if we decide to, whatever of yours we use, we would run it by you before we did that, before we published.
Well, that's very thoughtful. I appreciate that.
Just because I think that's a, professional thing to do. So, I've really, really enjoyed talking with you, and I think you're absolutely onto something there at Leading Edge. Is critical what you are doing.
Thank you.
As someone
that's
who grew up in
kind,
the,
especially as one who knows the field. So appreciate that. If H2Growth can ever be of assistance, let us know. And maybe if it's okay with you, I'll send you a little brochure about us. Please do. That would be really great.
Yeah. So, but mostly, thank you for taking the time. It was really cool to get to know you, because that's what these interviews do. Is they really allow me to get to know the people that I'm talking to very quickly. So, and of course,
you really cut to it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, right.
And
of course, I will thank Colin as well.
Of course.
So,
well, thank you. It's been great.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
You too.